Greetings everyone, this is Ehav Ever, and today I'm doing a video called Does Torath Mosheh have roots in Avodah Zara? Now, the question is, as presented before, does Torath Mosheh have roots in ancient Canaanite Avodah Zara, or in Hebrew as we call them Canaanim? So this topic involves a discussion I was saying on a forum that somewhat involved in every once in a while. And a question that came up concerning mainly the religious aspects of certain concepts that people have about whether or not the things in the Torah, whether or not the people of Israel in ancient times essentially had roots in the Canaanite nation, as well as the belief systems in the Torah, or what are claimed to be belief systems, if you will, from the Torah or from the Canaanites. So in order to go through this idea, because I think most people have heard this in one form or the other, especially if you're in the Western world where English is mostly the medium that this kind of discussion takes place. So in order to prove this particular point, if it would be to be proven, again, the question being, does the Torah itself, as well as the concepts and as well as Israeli culture, ancient culture, basically come from the Canaanites? We'd have to prove a couple of things to determine that. We would need to find eyewitness testimony of any of an information transfer from Canaanites to Israelis slash Jews. We would further need evidence that the influence wasn't from Israelis and Jews basically to the Canaanites. We would further need evidence that the Canaanite beliefs weren't modified from previously known information that was originally similar to or the same as what is found in the Torah. We would also need information from Canaanite sources about how their beliefs were to be correctly understood and their origins. And lastly, we would need information from Canaanite sources about how their language was correctly pronounced. So in order to go through this topic the right way, there are three words that I think need to be immediately basically thrown out of the conversation, and that is the word God, religion, and faith. It's my belief that these things have to basically be pushed aside. And if you go back and if you look in the description of this video, you're going to find a video that I did about Avodah Zara. And if you go through that video, that'll help explain some of the things mentioned in this video. And this will be kind of a continuation of some of those themes. So the basic principle is this. According to the Torah, and again, the Torah in Hebrew, not a translation of it in the Hebrew itself, the following is stated. Bereshith, Boro Elohim את השמיים ואת הארץ והארץ היותו תוהו ובוהו וחושך על פני תהום ורוח אלוהים מרחפת על פני המים ויאמר אלוהים יהי אור ויהי אור וירא אלוהים את האור כי טוב ויבדל אלוהים בין האור ובין החושך ויקרא אלוהים לאור ליום ולחושך קראו לילה ויהי ערב ויהי בוקר יום אחד. So essentially, I dealt with this in the previous video, the one about Avodah Zara. What is mentioned here essentially is the text of the Torah starts with a very statement that Elohim created everything, and I'll kind of get into what this means in a sense. But to put it in, I guess the best terminology, and this is using Jewish sources, ancient Jewish sources, the best way to understand this is similar to what is actually accepted in most science, in that essentially there was a point where everything that is in the universe was essentially in a very small point. This is actually mentioned in writing by the Rambam from about 500, 600 years ago. And that essentially there are also Jewish writings that say about, what can be calculated as almost like 14 billion years ago, there was this singularity event. That essentially caused all of the universe to exist. Now, this is a very simplified explanation of what's mentioned there, but it is very similar in a number of Jewish texts, and I'm going to do a video about this soon about the Torah and science that actually says some very similar things to various concepts that have either been, I guess you can say, investigated within certain realms of certain types of disciplines of science, as well as things that are accepted by various areas of science. But to kind of focus on this particular video, the essential point that I'm saying is that when the Torah uses the term Elohim, El, and Eloah, these terms have similar meanings as well as roots as well as connections to ancient languages in the Middle East and different parts of this region. Now, what's important is that the words in themselves do not mean what the English word usually means when people put upon the word God. These terms essentially mean to be first or chief or to be strong. And they basically deal with strength, and that's where the root that they come from comes. So it doesn't, mean deity. It doesn't mean something to be worshipped. It just means something that's strong. And the same is for the word El. So these words again are pronounced Elohim, El, and Eloah. So essentially, the Sumerians and some of the ancient cultures in this region also had similar meanings. Most scholars agree that the meanings of some of these words that are related basically deal with power and strength and not deity, which the word God in English, generally speaking, means deity. You wouldn't, for example, call a person a god, generally speaking, depending on the person. But generally speaking, most Western speakers would kind of like raise an eyebrow if someone said, "Well, this guy over here is a god," or "That chair is a god." And people could say, "Okay, well, people worship the chair for some reason," but the word Elohim doesn't mean deity, and it doesn't denote worship. What it basically means is power or strength. And the basic principles were discussed in the video I did about Avodah Zarah, but we'll go over these in a little bit also. So it's important to note that in the ancient Middle East, the terms that were used had some commonality between them, and pronunciations were similar. But generally speaking, the meanings didn't have anything to do with modern meanings of religion, of religious nature, which exists nowadays. So one of the things that's important to point out, and this is something I'm going to cover in the video I'm going to do at some point about the Torah and science, is that according to Jewish sources, all human beings knew about the source of creation. Now, someone may say, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Are you saying that all humans knew about God? No, 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 no. The Jewish sources are very clear that all human beings knew that there was a source of creation, meaning something that caused the universe to exist, not in terms of deity sense, but something that caused it to be. But that the idea of deity is something that came later and is a human response to the knowledge of there being a source. So continuing, sorry for that little pause, but continuing. Going based upon Jewish sources, if we kind of take this from like a global perspective, meaning that we have like the idea that at one point everything was interconnected land-wise at some point on the planet. There's a theory about that. Usually it's called Pangea. That the basic idea in Jewish sources is that every human being of modern humanity, if you will, knew that there was a source of creation. They essentially knew about Hashem. They may not have known particular names, or they may have forgotten particular names. And the names themselves that are in the text are not names the way people in Western society put on names, more like saying that there are characteristics that humans get from the Creator. In a sense that those names, that are mentioned in the Torah, are almost like signpost for those different kind of concepts. Essentially, that everybody knew who the creator was at a certain point, and that at some point, essentially, people divided themselves out, and either knew about the source of creation that existed, but then placed other powers upon certain things, and then some people just basically made up their own little concepts, that came a lot later, but that these are things that were known amongst all humanity. Essentially, the point I'm trying to make is that there is no concept in the Torah and Torath Mosheh that Jews were the first to like figure something out that never was ever known before. So it's like saying thousands of years, millions of years past, nobody knows that there's a source of creation, and then all of a sudden, Abraham bin Terach comes around and discovers something that nobody had ever discovered before. As we saw later, there's something he actually mentions in Jewish texts, or mentioned in Jewish texts, that he wasn't claiming to invent anything. That what he was basically saying was that this information was there, that there was a source of creation, but you guys just didn't forgot about it or left it behind. So essentially, one way to prove this out, because I once went through the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Mon's mentions in the Mishnah Torah about this topic, and I said, well, how do I know that's true or not? So one of the things I did was I did like a study, and this is from a paper that I put together, just kind of on the information that I went around looking for. And one of the things you find is if you look at some of the most ancient societies and cultures that have existed in the last number of different parts of the world, what you find is that pretty much predominantly all of them at some point in early history had this idea that there was one source of creation. And then you do find mentions of them, for example, believing and claiming that the source of creation gave functions to like other aspects of creation. Now, what you have to excuse here is that this information is just quoting from different things that I had found. And they use the word gods. But again, you have to wonder, okay, well, what was the Mesopotamian words that were used? Was it God? Did it even mean the same thing as God in modern English? And the reality is no. The information I showed you earlier is that it's like saying powers, and we'll go over what that means a little bit also. And that was also covered in the Avodah Zarah video, that the ancient languages of many of these cultures, when you take the word and say, okay, what does this word mean? Usually it denotes some type of power, meaning that they understood there was a power above all powers. And then they just simply started assigning characteristics to those things that this power, created, in a sense. So if we essentially go through and take this information and say, okay, well, Look at the Mesopotamians, for example. We know this is, if you can read the information that's here and see that they essentially had some idea that there was something that created everything. And then from some point, their system started to believe that there was, other entities out there. But they did believe that there was almost like a father of all of these things. And then even in China, you have earliest religious worship in China. It was found in the Shu Jing. And essentially what it does mention is this idea that there was essentially this power above everything else, that was like a supreme ruler, if you will. And this, kind of lends into this idea that it wasn't in just one region we're talking about. And basically when you get into Changdi, which is also, I think, a Chinese deity, that essentially they had this idea that there was this greater ancestor, or deity that controlled the victory in battle, harvest, and things like that. Um, and that at some point these like cultures started to kind of either modifying this belief in this one higher power, or believing that this higher power created other powers to kind of manage things, if you will. And even in Egypt at one point, you had a particular ruler who went back and tried to say, no, there was only one power that created everything. But this idea was not popular amongst the people in Egypt at the time that he came up with this idea. And they tried to, push very, hard, push back really hard on this idea, and basically push this belief system out of their culture. So brings us back to our question that we brought up originally concerning the Canaanites. And the question is, did um, the name of Hashem, for example, even, and again, this is where the question gets complicated. Did it have Canaanite origins? So you could take this in a couple of different areas, and this is, partially from a Wikipedia article. And again, I'm not saying Wikipedia is like the access point of all correct information. I'm just simply using its claim. So if you look at what's written here, you have to ask yourself a couple questions going back to what I mentioned at the very beginning of the video. If we're trying to parse out what the Canaanites believe and, and what influences they had, we have to kind of say, okay, well, first of all, how did they even pronounce, or how did they even describe the things that they were going by in terms of their belief? So this goes into this like particular um, inscription here. Now, one of the things that people say is, aha, this prescription has the name, the same name, that is used by Jews, or was used by ancient Israelis, a long time ago, that's mentioned in the Torah. But this brings up a couple of questions here. If you look at these symbols, these are the particular markings. Now, these are similar to different forms of ancient Hebrew, because Canaanites and Jews in certain regions, and also other peoples, Phoenicians, had a very similar writing system at a certain point. But Jews, for example, didn't really use this writing system for everything. Meaning that if you look archaeologically, you find the Jews had different like systems that they used, but the languages had, or almost like dialectal differences. But one of the things that comes up as a question to this is, how does one know how the Canaanites pronounce these letters? Because really, essentially speaking, the only way to really know is if the Canaanites told you that that's how they pronounced it. But what Canaanites have been around, for the last several thousand years. I mean, they didn't exactly provide you with a vowel system here, because ancient alphabets or ancient languages in this region didn't use vowels, for the most part. So the next thing we have to ask is, when did the Canaanites leave a description of their vowels? And that's what I was mentioning earlier, that this text, if you look at it, you could say it's like a yud, hey, and a wav, potentially. But then that leads into another question. How is it known, that the Canaanites consider, how is it known that the Canaanites consider this one word? Because you see two different like letters on one side, and then another one on the left side of this particular face that's there. So what most scholars say is that they believe, and again, they're very clear that this is something that is just based on their research of what they believe, because the Canaanites are no longer here to explain any of that stuff. One of the things that they believe is that the particular figure that was on that particular inscription may have been this deity that the Canaanites used to describe with this particular group of letters. The problem is that first of all, the Canaanites don't leave behind a detailed explanation of where they got their ideas. The scholars are not certain about how the Canaanites pronounced this word, or any other words of any language from back then that didn't have vowels. And basically, Torah-based Jews do not claim that the pronunciation that's usually used in the Western world amongst either Christians or scholars that are like non-Middle Eastern scholars is a valid pronunciation of the name of Hashem that's provided in the Torah. That's not something that Torah-based Jews have ever claimed, because again, if you were going to claim that, you'd have to go back and find a Jewish text from about 2,000 years ago or before that says, okay, and by the way, we pronounce this word exactly like this. And you don't find that, because Jews, at one point we weren't using vowels in our system. It was just simply that the information transfer amongst Jews and Israelis of how to pronounce the language was something that was transferred through oral process of, of transmitting to fathers to sons and children and this and that. And that's something I explained in previous videos. So this brings up to the question of, okay, well, who exactly were the Canaanites? Interestingly enough, there is a claim that's found among certain Palestinians nowadays that they are descendants of the Canaanites. But this brings up a very interesting problem of the fact that nobody in the regions that are known as Palestinians practices a Canaanite religion. Nobody in those regions speaks Canaanite as a language. They speak Arabic. And nobody essentially practices a tradition or culture that can be traced back to the Canaanites, including the way they dress and things like that. This also brings up another challenge, if you will, about exactly, okay, well, who can say, exactly what the Canaanites were if the Canaanites don't exist as an identifiable people nowadays? And the regions that they were in are regions that Jews, in ancient times, Israelis, and even during the time of Avram ben Terach, and people known as the Ivrim, were in these regions. So of course there would have been overlap in terms of what was known and what was believed and what was acceptable. But again, the basic principle, going back to the very beginning, is that the Canaanim, the Canaanites, would have had the exact same information that Jews had because everybody got it from the same source. It's just a matter of the main claim that Jews have is that at a certain point, the creator of all things, presented itself to the entire Jewish nation at Mount Sinai, and basically they had about 40 years to be able to prove out those ideas because things kept repeating upon themselves over and over again, as I explained in the Torath Mosheh video. So let's get into explaining why this idea that, for example, that is presented as if Jews are saying that we're, so special and we knew things that no one else knew beforehand, why this is a bit of a problem. Going back to the Mishnah Torah of Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, Hilchot Avodah Zarah, Perek Bet Aleph. So he mentions, and I think this was also mentioned in the Avodah Zarah video, that Ikarat Hatzivui ba'Avodah Zarah, shelo la'avod echad mekol ha'beruim, lo malach, lo galgal, velo chochav, velo echad me'arba yasodot, velo echad mekol ha'nivraim mahem. So basically the principle is that Avodah Zarah, and this was described in the previous video, is that it's a command against, actually considering to be a power of of service, serving a power, or serving something that was created. Essentially, Hashem created all things, and the things He created are asur, are forbidden for Jews and also non-Jews to serve. But essentially, that the non-Jewish nations at some point continued on this path of worshiping those things in some cases until somewhat in the modern era, where a lot of that stopped in a lot of places in the world. There's a lot of discussion about why that happened exactly, but essentially most of the world, there's only certain parts of the world where you'll find certain Avodah Zarah that's active like it used to be. There's a different type of Avodah Zarah that exists now, but it's the one that existed back then is a little bit different than it is now. So essentially the Rambam points out, "Af al pi she'oved yodea she'Hashem hu ha'Elohim, v'hu oved ha'nivra, hazeh al derech she'avad ha'enosh ve'anshe ha'dorot techila, harei zeh avodah zarah, oved avodah zarah." So what he explains is that even if the person were to know, now he says believe, he says to know, that Hashem is the one who is the power of all powers, if you will, and that he's serving something that was created, that this person is doing something in the way that the time of Enosh and that generation did it, they would be what's called Oved Avodah Zarah, I mean the ones who do Avodah Zarah. So this brings up something that I had mentioned before, and I was trying to make sure I found something online that I could post from what's called the Sefer HaYeshar. Now this is kind of like a midrash that has details that have been passed down through Jewish generations about things that are in the Torah. So this one mentions something very interesting. It's in Parashat Noach, and it says, and it's basically describing the certain point of Avraham before when he was living with his family in Ur Kasdim, and after they moved also to different areas in the region. And it says, וישוב אברהם בבית נוח וידע אברהם שם השם את השם ואת דרכו ויהי אברהם עובד את השם כל ימי חיו. And mention in what's that's basically mentioning that at a certain point Avraham had to leave his home and return back to his family at a certain point years later, and that he understood, Hashem at a certain point and knew Hashem. And it says, Avram, Shem et Hashem et Dorachov, that he knew the name of Hashem and also the path of Hashem, the ways that Hashem had originally given to the people of our modern humanity to live by. And in the green it says, V'kol hador hu shachachu et Hashem v'yavodu Elokim acharim etzva even v'yumrodu b'Hashem kol hayamim. So he says is that the people of that generation that Avram was living in had basically forgotten about Hashem, and that they began to serve like other powers, basically like it says like wood and stone, and that they basically rebelled against Hashem during those times. So going further into the next section, it says, "Ve'ata lo tov lachem la'asot et hadaborim ha'ele ata v'chol bnei adam hara'im ha'joloim elecho." So this is a response that Avraham gave. This is going further into the text. This is not like right after the part I just read. But when Avraham was confronted about him, basically starting to tell people and also starting to say the things that they were doing was Avodah Zara, that it was not correct or was not true. That was the main thing. It wasn't just that you guys believe the wrong things. He was saying that this stuff isn't true. None of this stuff created anything. So it'd be like someone telling you, like, hey, look, this tree or this stone or this statue you created didn't create the universe. It didn't create you and me. It has no power in and of itself. What you're doing is incorrect because it doesn't make any sense. There's a source of creation that created everything, and it's not this stuff. So essentially, that's what he's saying here. And what's in the yellow, it says, "Achisilim atem, o avilim atem, asher ein bachem tuvuna la'avod et ha'etz v'et ha'even v'la'asot kadavar hazeh." So what's mentioned in the yellow is that Avraham is telling the people there that this what you're doing, you guys fools. This is nonsense what you're doing. That you have no understanding, that you're serving like trees and like stones and stuff like that. That's basically the stuff that you're doing doesn't make any sense. So in the green, what's below, it says, "V'teshachu et Hashem Elokim asher asa et hashamayim v'et ha'aretz asher bara etchem ba'eretz v'tivu'u ra'a gadola ala nafshotechem b'davar hazeh la'avod etz va'even." So he's basically saying that that you guys forgot about Hashem who created everything, including the universe, reality. When Hebrew text says Shemayim ba'aretz, it's not just saying like the sky and the like land. It's talking about like all of reality. That's a generally speaking term. Hashemayim is used in the Hebrew text, but usually when people translate who don't have the Jewish background, what they try to do is just present it as like the heavens and the earth. What does that mean? What is heavens and earth? Jewish texts discuss what that means in a lot of detail in a lot of different texts, and generally speaking, what it means is that all of reality. That's a basic way of translating into modern English. And basically he's saying that that they had forgotten about the source of creation, basically, and that was the main issue that Avram was getting at. It wasn't about like specifically prayer, worship, gods, deities, and all that stuff, but that there's a source of creation that created everything. So continuing, and this was mentioned in the previous video, the Malbim, in his commentary, mentions something similar to the Rambam mentioned, and he says, "V'chol ma'aseh v'reshit nizkar Hashem Elohim levad." So essentially, that there was one source of creation, one source of power that created everything, and not like multiple things, for example. And that's what he's mentioning here. So what he mentions in the yellow, v'zukol be'ikarim shesam Elohim shabon beloshon rabim. So what he's basically saying is that the word Elohim, for example, people that are in modern English who look at the text in Hebrew and try to say, well, Elohim is like plural, but essentially what's explained is that the basis of the word is that the powers are plural. Because again, it doesn't, the word doesn't mean God. So because it doesn't mean God the way the English word God means, what it means to most people, it doesn't have the same context. So he says, continuing in green, מציין הכוחות הרבות המתפשטים בכל הבריאה. So essentially what he's saying is that it's discussing or describing the powers, that were sent forth. So essentially it's talking about the powers that were sent forth from the Creator himself when everything was created. And then it continues, שכבר התפעלו איך יצאו כוחות רבות משונות מהאל המיוחד בתכלית הפשיטות. So essentially it's like saying that one way of describing this in English would be like saying that all the principles that guide reality, it'd be like saying in modern English, you could say, let's say, all the principles of thermodynamics, physics, chemistry, all these things, came forth from the Creator, and that was a part of creation. So continue in the yellow where the arrow is. So essentially what he's saying is at a certain point that people made a huge mistake in applying ideas of Avodah Zarah, like foreign ideas, into the things that the Creator created, meaning the powers that the Creator created. So it'd be like someone, for example, worshiping thermodynamics. Or someone worshiping physics, or someone worshiping chemistry, or someone worshiping a chemical reaction, or someone worshiping the sun, someone worshiping, dark matter, all the things that were set in place that, basically cause the universe to exist. It'd be like someone creating ideas behind that because they've made a mistake and thinking initially that they can say, okay, well, I'm praising the creator of all things by praising thermodynamics. So we're going to build this temple of thermodynamics. We're not worshiping thermodynamics. We're just saying that the creator has harnessed, some of that power in thermodynamics, and we're going to utilize it by praying to it and doing so, such and such. So continuing the green, he says, Vahem Elohim Aharim Nizkarim Tamid. So whenever the Torah says Elohim Aharim, it's not talking about other gods. It's also talking about other powers, no matter what that power is. So it doesn't matter if it's even people, because people are called Elohim also in the Torah, meaning that people can be powerful. So there's other people who can be powerful. If someone starts worshiping them, that's Avodah Zarah, because again, they didn't create the universe. They're not the source of creation of the universe. So continuing, and in the bold in the bottom in the bigger letters he says, Ulamadnu Hashem b'chol ma'aseh v'rashid ki kol hakochot ha'ele yatzeu miha'el hamiyuchad. So essentially everything that you could consider a power in the universe came from Hashem. He's like the source of creation, if you will. And even I'm using the word he. The Torah, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, Rambam explains that the Torah is written in the language of men, because otherwise we wouldn't even know how to describe it. We'd be talking about a bunch of metaphysical terms, and most people wouldn't even get what we're talking about. So we use he. You could even again use it, but I mean, again, it's like saying Hashem. Of course, the source of creation is above it, he, she, or whatever. But essentially, it's like saying that the source of creation, Hashem. Essentially, all things that are in existence, all power that is in existence, comes from the creator of all things, the source of all creation. So in the last video, we talked about what's the different types of Avodah Zarah are, and we mentioned that one of them is Elilim, meaning that someone considers the different things that exist in the universe to be powers amongst themselves, to be things that can be worshipped and all that kind of stuff. And the thing to remember here is that the Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon in his book The Moreh Nevuchim explains that the creator of all things worked with what humans express and also feel, in terms of like saying, okay, if a person is used to like talking, well, prayer is a type of talking, for example, right? So prayer is an acceptable form of like, dealing with the reality to, the source of creation, because of the fact that that's human to do that. It's not like, the creator of all things sat down at the very beginning of time and said, okay, you must pray, and this is the way you pray. It's more like human beings develop these things, and the creator of all things worked around that, of what human beings are. But essentially, people started developing this idea, okay, well, I can pray to these things that are creations, or like nivorim, as it's said in Hebrew, things that are created items. It'd be like someone saying, an atom at some point is a created thing, meaning that it has an existence based upon things that happened at the very beginning of the universe. So I'm going to pray to those things too. At some point in ancient times, people started saying, okay, well, these different powers, I'm going to assign, visual images to them. I'm going to assign human characteristics to them. And that was all Avodah Zarah. And that's where the concept of Elilim or Elohim Aharim comes from. And it's not just, and that's the thing that some people make the mistake of thinking it's all about just these images that you see, that basically the Torah was fighting imagery, if you will. But it's not just the images. I mean, these are the results of human beings who created images based upon things that were their own desires to have. So it'd be like someone saying that any one of these images controls a certain part of the universe, and that's basically the starts of Avodah Zarah and the concept, but then in the actual implementation, that's where these particular images come from. So another issue, what was mentioned before, is the Canaanites coin that we saw earlier, where it has a person next to these letters that people are associating with a particular name. That's a type of shituf. And it's interesting, if you look at these two pictures, I didn't think about this till I put this together. The right side, you have a Christian interpretation of the Christian aspect of the Trinity, which is Avodah Zarah according to Torath Mosheh. But then you also look at this particular coin over to the left that the Canaanites put together, and you look and you see some very similar imagery in terms of this concept of birds and like putting out hands, and birds coming and landing between hands, and people representing these things. And Christians will tell you that they believe in the same source of creation that Jews do, but then they have some ideas that are like completely foreign to the Torah about them. And that look really similar to what the Canaanites were doing. And again, this goes back to the concept that shituf, which basically assigning partnerships with the creator of all things, is a type of avodah. So going back to what was mentioned in the Avodah Zara video, so the question is, okay, well, you're saying all this stuff, well, what is Hashem? And essentially you said he's the source of creation, or it's the source of creation. What is Hashem? So the best way to understand is what I mentioned in the previous video. It says the Rambam mentions in Hilchot Yesod Torah and Mishnah Torah, Yesod HaYesodot Amod HaHochmot Liyada Sheyesh Sham Mitzui Rishon V'hu Mamsi Kol HaNimsa. And sorry about that. I had to recap something, but it basically mentions in this text that Yesod Yesodot ve'amod ha'chochmot liyadam sheyesh sham matzui rishon v'hu mamsi kol ha'nimsa v'chol ha'nimsaim min hashamayim va'aretz u'mahem b'nehem lo nimsa'u ela ma'amitat ha'yimsa'u. So what the Rambam mentions here, and if you notice, what I mentioned before about the name of Hashem being there in the blue letters, is that it's basically there's a mitzvah, that they to know that there is a source of creation, something that is the basis of all the reality. And this is the thing, that it's not a belief, it's not a requirement for a Jew to believe this. It's something that all humans are required to know that there's a source of creation that caused all of the things that are created, and in a sense inventing all of creation, including what's in the universe, in space, anything that's on the earth or the various planets that exist in reality, and everything between it, basically. So it's like saying that everything, all of reality, exists because of this source of creation. So it says, continues, לפיכך אין אמיתתו כאמיתת אחד מהם. הוא הנביא אומר, והשם אלוהים אמת, הוא לבדו האמת, אין לאחר אמת כאמיתו. So he essentially says that one of the basic principles also is that this source of creation is the truth. It is, basically is the source of the truth. And it's like one, meaning not in terms of a number, but essentially in saying that it's unique, that essentially it created all things and there's nothing like it. And that's what he's basically saying further. And this is like something he's saying supported based upon the prophet Yemir Yohu, the Navi Nemir Nohu, and that the source of creation is itself, by itself, the truth, and there's nothing else with it. So continuing, what he says is, "Alo ze echad hu eno lo shanaim v'lo yoter al shanaim ela echad she'en keyechido echad min ha'achidim hanimsaim ba'olam." So essentially, what it means here is that this power, if you will, is one, and that there's not like two parts of it. There's no like more sections of it. It's not broken up into divisions and things like that. And that there's nothing like its unity, that or it's almost like uniqueness, and that the things that are like found, in the universe, nothing like it. That doesn't mean that, and this is something I'll get into when I get into the science aspect of it, that there is a concept that is found in different Jewish texts from about 2,000 years ago, that all the things that are made up in the universe that were created are found in human beings, for example. It'd almost be like saying all molecules from way out in space are found in human beings. You can say even like in the animal kingdom, there's representations of that within the human being, that human beings were created as well as all things created, somewhat interconnected. Now, the last thing that's mentioned here, it says, הרי מפורשת בתורה ובנביא שאין קדוש ברוך הוא גוף או גבייה. So essentially what this means is that the creator of all things has no body and has no human qualities. That essentially it'd be like saying the creator of all things created humans, but the creator of all things is not a human. That includes personality, that includes the concepts of feelings, emotions, things like that, that all of that is written into the text, as the Rambam explains later in this same text, is just an expression of how to write the Torah in a way that people can understand it, no matter what generation they're found in. But that the Creator is not human in any way. Essentially, debunking this idea that Jews borrowed from the Canaanites, this idea that the Canaanites had this, particular figure that maybe they believed in religiously, maybe they didn't, but they had this particular El that they believed in, that was a powerful person, but they represented it as a person, where the Jews were like, no, that, source of creation is not a person. It's obvious that the thing that created the universe wouldn't be a person, because you could also say, well, why would the thing that created the universe be human when it created an entire universe? Maybe it can be some other aspect of the universe instead of a human, but we know that the creator of all things is not made up of the universe, but is the source of creation of the universe. So going further, and ending the same way I did in the last video about Avodah Zarah, that Jews every day say twice every day, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. And this is, essentially the, if you will, marching point of all Am Yisrael throughout Jewish history, throughout the time of the giving of the Torah and even before, that the creator of all things is one, meaning that he's unique, or it's unique, and that it's not like anything that it created, and that all things that it created are different. So this basically breaks down this idea that you sometimes find in, English scholarship, that if you were to read it in English, you would be you'd get a wrong conception because of the fact that it's not being talked about in the languages that are represented in these regions. And this is also known amongst certain scholars. When they write papers, they have to write it to the general public who may not understand the ideas of the language. And this is the difference between trying to understand something in the language that it comes from rather than reinterpreting it in a different language. So this is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever, and thank you for listening.